I'm Ben Jeffries, Scotland lead for the Audience Agency, and for audio description purposes, I'm a white, middle-aged, bearded and bespectacled man in a blue V-neck. And I'm here to welcome you to this final insight session of this play series, looking at quite a large Scottish region, the North East Highlands and Islands. If you're interested in insights into other Scottish regions, these are available on our website, where this session will be added after today to complete the set. I'm joined by my colleagues who've created today's research, Isaac Key-Lavelle from our research team, and Oliver Mantell, Head of Evidence and Insight, who will shortly present. And after the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions. So please, if you can leave these to the end if possible, although we will be monitoring the chat through the presentation. So if you have any queries for sense or understanding, do ask in chat down there. Questions at the end are not included in the video on the website. So please ask whatever you want at the end. It's just between us. And with that, I will hand over to Oliver.
Lovely. I should also say that Ella is with us as well. Ella Brown, our researcher. So anyway, but again, for purposes of description, and this is slightly weird because I can't see myself on camera. I always feel like I need to describe what I'm seeing, and there's a risk I'll end up describing Ben. But yes, I'm a white middle-aged male, blonde hair, black t-shirt. And Ella, I don't know if you want to say a quick hello, given that you're the description bit, and then we'll jump on.
Hi, yes, so I'm Ella, be presenting part of it. I'm, for the purposes of audience description, I'm a white woman, female in her 30s with short brown hair, wearing a white top. Looking forward to talking about local events.
Lovely. Okie doke. So I will move along if it'll let me. So what we're talking about today, as mentioned, is this quite large area. And the reason we cover such a large area all in one go is we're partly relying on population data, and we'll talk about some of the stuff around that in a sec, partly on data that's in Audience Finder. And there are fewer cultural venues that we have within Audience Finder within this area. So rather than splitting it into lots of small groups, which meant it would be harder to talk about, we wanted to cover a wider area. So broadly speaking, we'll start off talking about the overall area of its population. Then we'll talk about audiences in the area. We'll unpack a little bit more about what we can say about audiences from other sources as well, and then have a bit of a conversation about what it all means essentially, and what conclusions we can draw from it, if any, but hopefully what conclusions we can draw. And we're using lots of different sources of information. So on a widespread scale, so when we talk about sort of the wider picture, we're using cultural participation monitor data. It's UK-wide, hence the listing here, but we will just be using Scotland data for that. We've also got information based on our segmentation model, Audience Spectrum. I'll introduce that in a sec, as well as data from, it says Audience Finder stroke Audience Answers, depending when the data came in. So essentially data about real actual audiences, as well as then a range of other sources, sort of census information, target group index information, and so forth. And worth saying in terms of census information that we're currently still using 2011 census data or annual updates where we've had those particular things like Audience Spectrum. The 2021 census data still isn't fully integrated with everything, although it's coming very soon. So unfortunately, we've not quite had time to get that one in. But just a little more intro on the data before we go into actually what it says. So I wanted to start off, and I try not to start off with apologies or caveats and things, but I'm going to start off with some caveats, partly because I think in this instance it's quite interesting. Because often when we talk about secondary data or sort of data sources we're using, it's very easy to produce what looks like a completely sort of all-covering, neat, tidy, everything summarized kind of view, because that's what essentially these data tools automatically do. So if you select an area, it colors in the whole area, even if there's some people in some bits of it and other bits of it and so forth. And it's really easy for quantitative data to end up looking like it's more confident in what it says than necessarily it might be. So to some extent, I thought it would be quite useful for us to just slightly fray the edges of that perspective, partly just in recognition that data is more complicated than sometimes these kind of simple views can give, but also to flag some particular things which I think will be relevant as we talk through. So when we summarize an area and we look at the average number of people in a particular patch, etc., or the average profile in a patch, particularly in rural areas, that can create some odd effects. So you can have a place which is like, a small village in a valley surrounded, with a mountain next to it, and the whole thing gets coloured the same way. But of course, there aren't people, generally speaking, who are living up the mountain. So we just need to be a little bit conscious of that, and that becomes really apparent across the Highlands. So there's that. There's also the fact that with there being fewer particular organisations, and this partly comes down to the thing up at the bottom, individual organisations start to be more prominent. So where, for example, we might have a whole load of venues in Glasgow or Edinburgh or Liverpool or whatever, and therefore any one venue being in or out is less, makes less of a difference. In this instance, individual venues being in or out will change the overall shape of what we're seeing. Most notably, so Eden Court data is in audience answers. But for particular technical reasons, which we're talking to them about and trying to resolve, the postcode data, or the kind of the geolocated bit of their system, isn't transferring through to our system. As a result, we can talk about the overall picture, including them, in terms of summary sales figures and so forth. But when we do things like mapping and profiling, we can't include that data because we don't know where those people are. So that's one caveat. And Pitlochry, I think there's conversations going on with them, but as yet their data isn't in the audience answers system. And as a result, those particular geographical centres will have less audience data included. We will talk a bit later on about which venues are included. Another thing to note is that in more rural areas, you tend to have larger postcode sectors because there are fewer people in a given area. But as a result, if you colour code a particular postcode sector, it can look really big, really prominent, really noticeable. So we just have to keep a mental check on that. So particularly today, when we talk about Aberdeen, there's lots of quite small postcode sectors, so we'll try and zoom in there in a little bit more detail. But sometimes you'll see kind of quite big patches suddenly lighting up, and it doesn't mean they're particularly dramatically important. It's just the way that the mapping looks. I've mentioned the census. The other thing that is worth noting is that a lot of our systems are based on the kind of basic data architecture is built through Experian, and there are some bits of Scotland that Experian doesn't have sort of logged and registered in the same way as other information. Now, I don't know the full details of all of that, so I'll have to sort of run that by our research team, but essentially means that occasionally in the most rural areas, we end up with completely blank patches where for them to just map the data into that area would be to draw kind of unrealistic assumptions. So there's kind of caveats around that. That will therefore mean there are blank patches on Audience Spectrum because it's using that system in order to be able to identify who lives where. But we've also taken a view that it would be misleading to draw big conclusions on areas with really small samples of people because it's misleading in the ways I've discussed. So there are some blank patches on the data. And I think, because I mentioned the venues, that's all of our caveats in one big swoop. But I think personally, it's quite good to be sort of frank about how those different bits of data work, and for us to then think about what are the ways we can understand audiences, what are the ways that we can understand populations. So we'll share what we can from this data, but then we can also think about how we do or don't fill out that picture. Okay, so I'm aware that some of you may be more or less familiar with Audience Spectrum. So apologies to those of you who know Audience Spectrum backwards, but we'll refer to it quite a bit during the presentation. So it's, I think, quite important that everyone's on the same page on this. So I will just do a little précis of Audience Spectrum, and then we'll maybe talk about some of these groups in more detail. So Audience Spectrum is essentially, it's a way of carving up the whole population into 10 groups based on a combination of the kinds of typical things that they do and are interested in culturally. So, you know, a culturally specific segmentation model. But then also that's linked to a whole range of demographic and geographic information, so we can then kind of situate where these different types of people tend to be. It doesn't mean that everyone in every group behaves exactly the same, but there is a tendency for people with the same kind of bundle of characteristics to behave in particular ways. So there's 10 groups. They're broadly speaking arranged in order of how much they tend to do cultural activities. So we've got a group of highly engaged people who hopefully will appear now. Yep. So we've got these 3 groups that are relatively highly engaged, of which the highest engaged is the one that's of least interest to us in terms of today's session, because they tend to be based in very large metropolitan areas, particularly London, a bunch of them in Edinburgh, and so forth. But they're not big in this area, so we'll leave the metropolitans to one side. There are, however, lots of this group called community-land culture buffs, who are on average a little bit older, a little bit more traditional in their tastes. They tend to live sort of, you know, slightly further out from urban centres. They do tend to have a relationship to urban centres, so they won't be right out in the most rural areas, but for example, we'll see a whole bunch of them out to the west of Aberdeen. And then experience seekers, who tends to be kind of younger, more university graduate types. I say younger, some of them are up into their kind of, you know, 40s, etc. But, you know, there's a tendency for them to be a bit on the younger side. Again, they tend to live in urban areas. So again, Aberdeen is the main place that we see them in this patch. But most notably, and we'll come on to this when we talk more about the profiling, particularly in terms of the population profile, we've got lots of these middle engaged groups across the Highlands and the North East. So most notably dormitory dependables, we'll end up talking about them a fair bit today. So they tend to live in more, I guess, dormitory towns. They may well have families, but they'll tend to be older families or having sort of nest in some cases. So they tend to be quite culturally, you know, potentially quite culturally engaged, but mainly for more mainstream things, more high profile things. They don't tend to go towards kind of like really sort of weird and edgy stuff. Got home and heritage, who tend to be more rural and tend to be more traditional in their taste. They tend to be, I guess you kind of, you know, National Trust of Scotland kind of members. So they tend to like things to do with heritage and crafts and so forth. And then you've got trips and treats, it's the other middle engaged group, where they tend to be younger, often families, sort of in suburban areas, etc. We'll see a whole range of pockets of them, particularly. I think there's a hot spot near Inverness. So that's those middle engaged groups. They're going to be really important. We'll talk about those quite a bit today. There are a range of lower engaged groups. Some of these tend to be more urban based and so are less present in the areas we're talking about. So I will probably dwell upon these a little less, but essentially we've got kaleidoscope creativity, which tends to be really larger urban areas. They're quite big in Scotland overall. They're quite big in Glasgow, for example, but they're not so much in this little patch. So I'll jump over those. Up our street tends to be older settled communities in kind of, you know, I guess sort of terraces and or flats in big urban areas. Skewing slightly on the older side, less actively engaged in kind of certainly funded culture than many other groups. Frontline families tend to be younger, often harder up family groups. They are kind of, I think, quite well sprinkled across the map, but not in huge numbers. And we really mainly see pockets of those in and around Aberdeen. And supported communities they're quite an interesting group because each of these groups have 2 subtypes, and supported communities is the one with the subtypes that are really quite distinctly different in many ways. There tends to be a younger subtype who tend to live in sort of council or local authority supported housing, and then an older group who again may well be in sort of supported housing, flats, council flats, etc., but very much more likely to have health related issues. They may well have long-standing interest in culture, but their change in personal circumstances meant that they're no longer maybe as able to be as active, certainly outside of a relatively contained local area. So particularly supported communities locally based activity is really where it's at in terms of those groups. So that's a bit of a whistle stop in terms of description of the segments. There's loads more information, including a whole series of new kind of motivational guides appended to each of these, or describing each of these groups in more detail. Each of them is also split into these 2 subgroups I mentioned, and we'll talk briefly about some of those in terms of how they affect the most prominent of these, particularly in our patch. It's worth really saying, I've sort of described the information that goes into it, so I'm not going to unpack that more. There is a whole load of extra summary information. So if you go on our website, theaudienceagency.org, and look for particular segments, there'll be summary information about who they are, what they think, what they tend to like, the art forms they go to, where they tend to be based, or their digital habits, and indeed, what kind of messages and or channels might be relevant in terms of communications. So there's a whole load of extra information about them. Those new guides are really fun as well in terms of getting a really vivid sense of who they might be. And then for each of them, as we see here, each one's got subtypes, which will say, well, actually, these ones, they're in the broad same category, but these skew this way and these skew that way. So, for example, experience seekers, there's a kind of a midlife professional version who essentially have grown up a bit from being the other type, which is the much more young students and new graduates. So you can see they broadly have a whole bunch of stuff in common, but they have sort of different characteristics and they're based in different places. That's particularly relevant for a couple of the segments where it's really one particular subtype that's prominent in the northeast and other segments. But as I say, that's a kind of like a view of all of these 20 different subsegments, but we'll zoom in on some of them in particular. So before I come to what the actual data says, does anyone have any questions, or are there any questions in the chat so far? I'm partly looking at Ella, just because you're on camera, so I can see you. But it seemed like we're good. Lovely. So let's see what the data says. So first thing is the local population. So who are our local population? So we'll largely be looking at sort of summary demographics and audience spectrum. We've also included some information about Scottish indices of multiple deprivation, partly just because it's an incredibly helpful tool, and you can get really specifics if you're working in one particular location or touring to a place or whatever. You can get really good granular information about that area in a way that's really kind of user friendly and free. So that's kind of useful to know about. First things first. Particularly when we're looking at a rural area or a largely rural area, it's worth being really clear about where there are and aren't people. There's a classic XKCD online comic, which if you haven't seen, it's number 1138, which basically shows like maps of America where everything always seems to be the same, because there are areas where people live and where people don't. You can make all sorts of jokes about, therefore, what the overlap apparently is between certain different types of people with interests. You can run the same risk if you're looking at this kind of mapping, where you say, oh, there's a hotspot of around Inverness of this group. There's a hotspot around Inverness of this group, and it turns out it's because there's a hotspot of population. So this is our kind of opening, just to be clear, where we're talking about hotspots. And of course, again, I mentioned there's really small postcode sectors in and around Aberdeen. So you can see, although there's a relatively constrained patch with what looks like quite dark areas, there's a lot of postcode sectors, each of which contains a lot of people, as opposed to maybe quite large postcode sectors, which across the whole of that area contain. So just bear that in mind. We'll come back to it as we go through. So first thing to say is, well, which of these types of people we've been talking about are there in the Northeast Highlands and Islands? And obviously I've spoiled this slightly from my initial description, but essentially there are lots of people who sit within these 3 middle engaged groups. So getting on for half the population in these 3 out of 10 groups that are middle engaged. Particularly, there are absolutely loads of this group called dormitory dependents. 1 in 5 people across the whole of the area sit within that group. So that's quite interesting. It suggests that you've got a kind of potentially interested and engaged audience, albeit very widely spread in many cases, and not absolutely kind of at the higher end of super engaged will absolutely kind of crawl over broken glass to go to the latest weird edgy thing. So you need maybe that needs to factor into thinking about the kinds of work that is most likely to be appealing. Very, very few of the metroculturals group, as you can see. Scotland has fewer than England. Well, to be fair, London really. But particularly in this patch, there are very, very few at all. In some ways, the picture here for some groups like trips and treats is actually in line with the UK picture, but ahead of larger than the Scottish picture. Dormitory Pendables obviously sticking out particularly prominently. We mentioned the Clydescript creativity being big in some parts of Scotland, but it really isn't here. And generally speaking, the lower engaged groups, on average, tend to be less represented in this patch. Certainly in the UK, particularly in Scotland, with the exception of frontline families and settled communities, supported communities, where we do see little pockets in and around, as we'll see on the mapping. But as I say, really high concentration in those middle engaged groups. But if we break it down a little bit more, it's not an entirely consistent picture in terms of subgroups. So by and large, there is a bit of a leaning towards one subgroup rather than the other. So less so with Dormitory Pendables, just because there's quite a lot of all of them. But trips and treats, most of the people who are trips and treats are trips and treats 1, as it's called. Sorry, this should be trips and treats 2. So they tend to be older families. As well. Good show. We've got the descriptions on the next slide, so we'll look at them. But up our street again, it tends to be segment 1 rather than segment 2. So again, when you're looking at the descriptions of who are the people in this particular patch that I want to target, if you're interested in targeting up our street or frontline families, you can look up and see, well, actually the description of segment 1 of those groups is going to be much more relevant to you than the description of segment 2. So you can kind of skew your understanding towards who's actually represented within this area. So speaking of that breakdown, so this is comparing the profile of the subtypes, so the more detailed 20 groups compared to the Scottish population overall, and we can see a bit of a mixed picture going on, in that there's a few that are really quite a long way to the right, so they're much higher represented than the Scottish population in this area, and others which are much lower. So in some cases, for some segments, both subsegments are above the line, so community-like culture, trips and treats.
And sort of trips and treats groups matches in terms of the F1 subgroup as well. So we get this kind of family group that they're both quite overrepresented in this area, whereas you see in the rest of Scotland it tends to be that Kaleidoscope creativity are very high, usually across Scotland, but in this area it's quite different in that we have the trips and treats groups of people feeding into Aberdeen and feeding into different areas, and then so the frontline families, obviously that's over the line a lot as well. The F1 these older families rather than younger families, whereas do we have a trips and treats, we have a bit more of a mix of kind of both age families, and then lastly the sport communities. We have more of the S2 subgroup, which is the elderly residents or sheltered housing, tends to be in cities and sort of on the outskirts of cities, which is kind of one of the hardest groups to engage. So we'll move on to the next one for now, the overview of demographics. So this is just a slide just kind of summarising the area compared to Scotland. So in this, the outer ring is our area, and then the inner ring is Scotland. Just an overview of the demographics. So you can see that the families and retirees are very similar in terms of averages to the rest of Scotland. Obviously, with coming kind of from Aberdeen is are fairly kind of standard compared to the rest of the big cities in Scotland. But as of Edinburgh and Glasgow and places, students are a bit lower than the rest of Scotland, but still at around 3%. And later we'll look at a bit more at retirees. Despite the percentage there, they are a bit overrepresented in various different areas. So we'll kind of show where the retirees are. The educational levels are kind of relatively similar to the rest of Scotland, slightly lower on some of the kind of highest educational stuff. And in ethnicity, the area obviously being very rural, apart from Aberdeen, is less diverse, sort of in general, than the rest of Scotland. Though of course Aberdeen has various coastal sectors and areas that are more diverse in terms of the area. That's somewhere that I think Ollie, if you can hear us, I think Ollie's just rejoined via his phone, although just yeah, hear the chat, Ollie, or
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
Beg your pardon. Yes, there's been a power cut on our street and everything's gone down, including Wi-Fi and everything else. So, are people still there?
Yes.
Yes, I think everyone's still here, and I just finished the slide you were on and did the overview of the demographics.
Brilliant. That's amazing. So, if you like, I can keep talking and then ask you to click on the slides.
Yeah.
There's Ella sharing screen, so she can click through. Okay.
Will do.
Yeah. So you're
Right.
and apologies everyone for this. This is obviously not entirely as planned, but there we are. So you say you finished the population description.
Yeah,
Or
just the overview. This slide I've just finished. Yeah. So I think
then-
there's one. If you click, Ella, there might be a little thing. Yeah, just to mention that there's a little list there of the more like the most diverse postal sectors within Aberdeen that are there. There's obviously parts of Aberdeen that are quite higher for Asian, British, and different things. And the small chart there that I think you made, Ollie, just comparing the kind of it's quite similar in our area compared to Scotland, which is could be a bit surprising.
Yeah, I think that was particularly in relation to the previous slide where we've seen that we had those sort of subtypes that were particularly high across, so it looked like it was often type 2, it was tend to be relatively older, but actually on average the whole population still comes out pretty even. So what we're not getting is the kind of effect we saw in Cumbria, for example, where you've got an area which is largely more rural, and as a result, on average, there's more retirees and fewer families. That hasn't played out here. Cool. Okay. In which case, if you want to click us on, so this really is just summarising what the biggest differences are in terms of the local areas that we see here. So I suppose we'd probably start with Aberdeen itself because it's such a large population centre, and we're seeing a different, much more urban audience, more metropolitan experience seekers, and those groups will be relevant later on, particularly when we're looking at kind of changing trends in terms of engagement. A small but larger than anywhere else Asian British population, more students, more people with higher qualifications, of course, lots connected to the oil industry, but of course more broadly in terms of that kind of population. Aberdeenshire itself, though, we've got lots and lots of these dormitory dependents and trips and treats, as well as pockets of the community land culture buffs. Although there are even more community land culture buffs when we look at sort of our Garden Butte and more retirees, more home and heritage. So that's much more of a kind of sort of traditional retired, potentially highly engaged, but more culturally traditional kind of area. Then we've got some pockets of deprivation, particularly around Moray rather. across the Highlands, interestingly, lots of families. So I said that's kind of balancing out that overall picture. And then Western Isles, slightly, more higher levels of disability and long-term health issues, but also, sort of a fairly mixed population in various ways as well. But notable really that we're talking about 2/3 or more than 2/3, probably 3/4 of people coming from 3 particular local authorities. So although we could have got this very large geographic area, really it's these 3 particular areas. So that's just worth bearing in mind. And I guess the other thing with the Highland is that's presumably boosted by Inverness, bringing that proportion up. So we mentioned talking about the indices of multiple deprivation data. This is kind of interesting, not just really exclusively in terms of sorry, someone's trying to contact me, which is really not helpful. Can you still hear me, Isaac?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, I'll just ignore them. So the so the deprivation data is interesting, not just for deprivation itself, because it gives you a bit of a sort of a clue onto a wide range of other differences that might be happening in areas. So it's really helpful if you're working in a particular place to zoom in on this. We can see this overall picture of Scotland here. Oh, sorry, if you could advance the slide, sorry. Yeah, so this is the overall picture, which splits the population into areas which are sort of 10 groups of how deprived they are, ranging from red to blue for the least deprived. So you can see big pockets of blue around Aberdeen. There's lots of affluent areas there, which we'll touch on, but also some spread out further elsewhere, particularly, for example, Shetland, half of Orkney, less so in the Western Isles, less so in the Highlands. But as we get further south, we get to the further pockets as well. If you advance to show the more detailed picture, you can see the Kirkwall, particularly actually just out east of Kirkwall, is the sort of the most affluent areas in the Orkneys. Quite large, quite broad coverage across Shetland. And if you move on again, here's where we see the kind of zoomed in picture showing Aberdeenshire on the left, but then more specifically Aberdeen centre on the right. So again, here you can see there's really quite stark contrast between the different areas of Aberdeen. For example, areas like Broomhill, which slightly confusingly for me is the same name as a place in Sheffield, but which is similarly sort of nice leafy area. So the Broomhill area, but less so as you get further out, or sort of along the coast, and sort of, I guess, for obvious reasons, but also Northfield. You get these pockets of more greater deprivation. So that's the overall picture in Aberdeenshire, and you can see that sort of close pocket in Aberdeen itself stretches out further to the west. Then, so you can see there's some of these quite broad areas, but even sort of general coverage as well. Inverness itself, though, once we get onto the next slide, again you can see quite a split picture. Sort of the city itself, quite high concentration of deprivation, but there's pockets to the south and particularly out to the east, which is Culloden, I believe, is the other sort of area around there. And Elgin, again a similar picture but flipped round, so it's out to the east and south it's less affluent, and to the west it's more so. So anyway, depending on where you're focused, that can be a really handy tool. If we move on, because I'm aware that our little break has interrupted our timing slightly. So high concentration of family groups, particularly in that sort of area around Aberdeen, but also pockets elsewhere. The top of the Western Isles, the right sort of top far corner of the Highlands and Shetland as well. But again, sort of different concentrations, but fairly well spread. Lots of retirees, and they tend to skew slightly further south, and in a way they're the flip side of that, the picture we saw in families. Now this looks at what we could describe as the dominant audience segment, and here you can see you've got some blank patches as previously kind of forewarned. But this is showing the audience spectrum type that is most prominent in a particular area. And obviously some of these very large areas which have lower population densities, but there's lots of the dormitory dependables across kind of quite a lot of the map, so this kind of this sort of browny colour. But then there are pockets, particularly out to the west, of more of the home and heritage. The dark purple, sort of what I sometimes think of as almost like audience reservoirs of sort of potential highly engaged audiences. So you've got that band coming west out of Aberdeen. You've got a sort of big concentration there, which is I guess around Pitlochry, I think, and then it's sort of a little bit further south. But again, they're probably more likely to drain into the central belt in terms of engagement. But then you can also see speckled in amongst some of the other segments there as well. But it gives a bit of a sense of where the concentrations of these particular groups tends to be. Now, what I have done, and this is where I have a little bit of fun with the animation, is because I showed you earlier on looking at where the overall population was based. And so what we don't want to do is look at this big map covering large rural areas and think, okay, so there's lots of dormitory dependables in that bit, when actually it's an area with relatively low population. So this is showing the dominant segment map. If we then, so this is the population, so the grey scale. So this, if you can then sort of focus on those areas with really high, really dark patches, and then advance onto the next one. So you can see that actually some of those patches stay quite dark because they're dormitory dependables. So there's that patch near Inverness, there's patches on the outskirts of Aberdeen, which is still quite prominent. Some of these other areas, essentially where you can see the colours more vividly, that's just actually those areas where there are fewer people. So again, that might be something to revisit when you're looking at particular focused areas later on. So shall we keep moving? So this then is looking at the closer zoom on those dominant segments. So this is really showing that thing we were saying about Aberdeen, that you've got this big swathe of Key-Lavelle culture buffs, these kind of highly engaged, older, more traditional audiences out to the west. You've got pockets that's up our streets, kind of like the sort of more, well, sort of lower engaged typically, but sort of rural, not rural, terraced or kind of quite settled housing, etc. You've got the experience seekers, so the kind of where there's a kind of young, slightly sort of more sort of contemporary art skewing audience. That's right in the sort of concentrated heart of Aberdeen, and indeed where there are kaleidoscope creativity being prominent, it's really there rather than elsewhere in the patch. And some of those families scattered around the trips and treats as well, sort of mixing it up. So that's the kind of broad picture in terms of Aberdeen. And if we move on to the next one, we can then see these, the patches of Key-Lavelle culture buff. So we've seen that one outside Aberdeen. We've seen there's a band up between sort of Inverness and Elgin and along the sort of east coast of Loch Ness, and indeed some towards Edinburgh and Glasgow. If we zoom in a little bit, we can see that picture around Aberdeen. It's really quite a concentration, and indeed around Elgin as well. And then moving on. So this is the dormitory dependables. So we saw that they were the dominant segment across large chunks of the map. But here, if we just do it as counts, we can see that actually lots of those areas, that's much less of a prominent factor. Again, it's that pocket around Inverness, Elgin, and indeed just north of Aberdeen. Okay, so that's our dormitory dependables, and we can see that in a little bit more detail there on the next one. But we'll just keep moving for the time being. And yeah, okay. So then the trips and treats, we saw the scattering around Aberdeen. Again, it's that patch around the sort of just south of Inverness is particularly notable. And then moving on. So yes, there's probably not a huge amount to say more about that group, except that they're holding up pretty well as an audience group post-COVID. So they'll become increasingly prominent within the mix of audiences to a certain extent. So maybe just worth being a little bit conscious of that, but that's where they are. And then moving on, just and this is really for reference more than anything. We're not going to go into it in detail now, but this is showing the wards with the highest concentration of each of the spectrum types across the whole of the area. And one thing that really jumps out is that for several of these, or about half of them, all of the areas that are highest are Aberdeen. So Aberdeen is very much kind of like a different picture, and then we see the different concentrations elsewhere. Some of these groups are very concentrated where they do appear. So although we're not seeing huge numbers of experienced seekers in general, in certain patches they're almost all of the population. You see there in Ferry Hill. Some other segments are never really that prominent in the mix. So we saw that little patch of up our street in Aberdeen, but it was only ever getting on for about a quarter of the population actually fit that group. So yeah, a bit of variation there, but worth noting at least. So I think that gives us a good pause point if we've got any questions from the chat, or anything that anyone's asking about. Is this seeming clear to people so far? I will take that as a yes and keep rolling. So if that's what we're saying that the local population looks like, so big concentrations of these middle engaged groups, for example, let's see what that actually looks like when we get into the audiences. So this is looking at the profile of bookers to any events anywhere in the audience answers database, anywhere across the UK. Of course, realistically, people attend where they live, so it will largely be more local attendance. But this is people from the area attending anywhere. What's the overall mix of those people compared to the population? And here we can see very prominently that there are 3 groups that are very overrepresented, but only really 2 that are substantially overrepresented in terms of numbers, and that's commuter land culture buffs and dormitory dependables. So what we're seeing is that the bigger the group, the less overrepresented it is of those 3. So it depends whether we're thinking about who's most likely to be attending as an individual or who's making up most of the attendances as a group. But we're seeing loads of the dormitory dependables attending. So it's really, really big concentration, almost half of people from those 2 groups alone. So though community land culture buffs, dormitory dependables often behave a bit similarly, it's just that one tends to be more culturally engaged. They tend to have the money to attend things if they want to, by and large, be less affected by things like cost of living, as we'll see in a bit. They are prepared to sort of spend on high value tickets, but it tends to be things that are more traditional, more high profile, sort of a greater stamp of quality on them in some way, sort of like a known quantity, particularly for dormitory dependables. But those groups are being particularly prominent in the mix. So I think that's really worth noting, particularly when we're thinking about how we might respond to those groups, and indeed how we see the post-COVID trends playing out, because those groups are also slightly vulnerable in that territory as well, as we'll see. So here, moving on, so we're revisiting our dominant segment map, but this is then showing the booker dominant segment map. So what we might want to do is just toggle between those a couple of times. So you've got the population, and we can see these big swathes of the dormitory dependables, and some patches of the community land culture buffs, those kind of dark purple. And if we move on to the next one, so you'll see some of those shifting, some of the other groups coming through, some places where there are lots of home and heritage actually now switching to being more, community land culture buffs being particularly key, and even in some cases, trips and treats. So yeah, if you just move between those, you can see that increased prominence. And again, it might be worth thinking about when you're looking at the audience for a particular area. You might think, well, who's the population in that area, but also specifically who's actually attending from that area, and does that look a bit different? Okay, so if we move on to the next one. So this is showing sort of the overall distribution of bookers. And of course, because some particular venues will be more prominent in the mix. Aberdeen Performing Arts will be notable. You know, we've got sort of Atlanta and we've got Shetland, particularly prominent. Leicester, well, we don't have Eden Court in geographical data, at least here. So you would get a slightly different picture if all of those were involved. But you know, it's maybe sort of worth noting at least where the audiences we're talking about are coming from. And if we move on, so this is the actual sort of percentage penetration of the population, which really is showing the concentration among those particular places. But more usefully, if we zoom in on Aberdeen itself, we can then see that patch out to the west. We saw lots of community land culture. Sure enough, that is the area that lots of people are attending from. But there is also this pocket attending, in quite high concentrations out to the north. Less so right from that centre, particularly some of those areas we saw that we were right on the coast that were less affluent, and this reflects quite neatly in many ways back on that sort of in-situ multiple deprivation picture in terms of engagement. So if we move on then to look at local and non-local audiences, so this is trying to summarise what's potentially a slightly fiddly concept, but we've got people who live locally who are attending organisations locally. That's the first bar of each trio. People who don't live locally but are attending locally, and then people who do live locally but are going to anything anywhere else in the within Audience Finder. And so what I guess we're seeing is there is a slightly greater tendency for people to be heading outwards amongst community land culture buffs, staunch dependables. Even actually the home and heritage, so that might be about people attending some of those sort of large scale venues in the central belt that will pick up quite large volumes from that further more southern areas. And to some extent, this isn't that surprising, because what we tend to see is that certain different audience groups are more or less likely to be sort of willing and able to travel. So, higher levels of car ownership, et cetera, et cetera. So you would expect it to skew that way, but it's worth noting, I guess, in terms of how those audiences vary. If we then move on to sales change, I wonder if it's worth us maybe taking 5 minutes now and then coming on to this in the next bit. I think it probably is. So yes, can I suggest that we stop recording? So welcome back. Let's carry on looking at the audience picture, and in particular looking at how audience behaviour and audience figures have changed in the sort of the post-pandemic era, with caveats around the words post-pandemic for all the usual reasons, but nonetheless, compared to what they were like, let's say, sort of 3 or 4 years ago. So if we can move on to the first one. So you can see that's the list of organisations who've got included, and not in the profiling, but in the overall sales figures included Eden Court. And overall, the picture is pretty positive in terms of ticket numbers. They're fractionally up on what they were across this group of organisations. And we're also seeing, which is different from the general picture we're seeing elsewhere, that this is happening off a slightly smaller range of performances. So what we're seeing in lots of the rest of the UK and lots of the rest of Scotland is that people are staging more and more productions, and that's kind of trying to pull the number of tickets up. But here you've also got the opposite. So each event that's happening, certainly we're seeing data on, tends to be more full on average than they used to be, albeit that's because there's fewer of them. So that's potentially quite a positive picture. And then if we look at the month by month trend, we can see there's a little bit of a kind of a caveat maybe we'd want to put around that picture. So it was the case, looking back to the beginning of the last financial year, that things were just a little bit behind what they were. Not surprising, there've been restrictions in place and relatively recently at that point. but as we got into the summer, early autumn, the sort of things had fully bounced back and were sort of higher than they had previously been, and indeed holding up pretty well through the back end of the year. But March, we sort of see the pictures flipped a little bit, and it's sort of dropped back, albeit the overall numbers themselves aren't actually down. And although we haven't followed this through in sort of April, May, etc., we have heard in a range of places that they have got this similar pattern happening in terms of recovery, where things were down, then they came back up again, but they just ebbed a little bit as cost of living stuff has really started to bite and go on and on and on, and therefore, its impacts kind of gradually magnify. So there's a bit of a lumpy recovery picture, but so far overall, the net picture is positive, even if more recently it's probably less so. But the other things happening in the midst of this process is not just about how many people are attending or how much they're attending, but also about which people are attending, and that has also shifted a little bit. So if we move on to the next couple of charts, actually illustrate this in different ways. But first up, we've got the shift in profile. So how each segment has changed over that time. So here what we've done is we've set whatever the figure was for a particular segment in 2018-19 as 100, as a kind of standard index figure. And then we've seen how each segment has changed in terms of audience numbers between from that point and looking later on. And what we see is an interestingly a fairly clear and consistent picture that by and large, some groups were growing pre-pandemic, so particularly experience seekers, metroculturals, so those groups that are really only largely concentrated in Aberdeen in this patch, but they've tended to be attending more, and sure enough, they've actually bounced back better as well. So it seems like it's not just a response to COVID, cost of living, etc. There was something that's kind of already there in the mix. Some of the groups that have bounced back less well, home and heritage, supported communities, up our street, community and culture buffs, these are all, relatively speaking, older groups, and in many cases they tend to be a bit more rural. And to some extent they weren't doing as well pre-COVID either. So that's kind of interesting that it almost seems like it's an extension of that earlier pattern, but a fair degree of disparity between how different segments are doing. You see one of those is like twice, relatively twice the level of the highest compared to the lowest. So a bit of a shift in profile, a bit more urban, a bit more of a skew towards higher engaged groups, indeed probably higher education groups in some of those cases, experience seekers and metroculturals being relatively higher proportions of university graduates and the like. And if we move on to the next slide, so this is looking again at bookers from the area, but looking at how many tickets they're buying relative to before. And here we can see a similar picture. So if it's over 100, it's they're doing buying more than they were, under 100 buy less than they were, and sure enough, we get this similar split. So experience seekers, particularly Kaleidoscope Creativity, relatively higher, so they're more urban-based groups. But again, we saw there weren't loads of them, particularly the latter. Some of the more rural groups, or some of the older groups in particular, home and heritage, supported communities, dropping fairly substantially. So this is across the whole of the area, and sort of anyone booking to anywhere from this area. Dormitory Dependables is the other one that's really notable, because although it's not up as much as some of the other groups, it's only 8% up. We saw it as a huge group, and a hugely important group, and so it's becoming an increasingly prominent part of the overall audience. So again, we keep coming back to them as being really important. But yeah, if I was in your shoes, I think one of the things I would take away is really going away and having a look at the detailed information about Dormitory Dependables, how that relates to this patch and what they might be interested in doing. So the next chart tries to take that same information and merge all of these different, some of these different factors together to get to allow us a combined view. As a result, it's a little bit trickier to explain, so bear with me. So what we've got is, of the most recent year's bookers, this along the bottom, what proportion of the overall bookers from this area were in each of these groups? So we've seen Dormitory Dependables, the biggest group, Community and Culture Buffs, next biggest, Trips and Treats, and so on, heading to the left. And unsurprisingly, the lower engaged groups tend to be further left because they tend to book less. But some of these other groups, they're quite big, they're quite prominent in the local area, and as a result, the middle engaged groups are still quite high in the mix in terms of total number of different tickets. Now on our vertical axis, we've got how their engagement, that essentially it's the figures from the previous slide, so how they're engaging relative to pre-COVID. So we can see dormitory dependables, a high chunk of bookers, and they're performing better than they were pre-COVID. And these are also scaled by how much the population's in that group. So it's a really big group. They were really important to bookers. They're doing really well. They're clearly really, really prominent. Some of the other groups, so community land culture buffs, they're still a big chunk of bookers, but they're just doing a little bit worse than they were before COVID. So they're dipping a little bit. Experience seekers, similar size in the population to community land culture buffs, have been booking less overall. They're a lower proportion of total bookers, but actually they're booking more than they used to. So they're a bit higher up. So you can see they're kind of gaining in prominence and importance within that overall picture. Home and heritage, very notably, were a moderately large chunk of bookers previously, but actually they're dipping away. So they don't become less and less important, despite being, still a reasonably substantial chunk of population. So hopefully this captures in one view a bit of a sense of which groups are growing and shrinking and or relatively more important in terms of volume of activity. But essentially all roads lead back to dormitory dependables as being this really key group. Does that make sense? Anyone have any queries on that? In which case, I'm going to pass over to Ella just for a change of voice to talk about that wider picture on what else we know about some of these groups and what they think. So over to you.
Yeah. So yes, what else can we say about local audiences? So here I'm just going to talk a bit about the data participation monitor. And so this is looking at data across the entire of the UK, which we can see sort of how it compares to the Northeastern Highlands and Islands data that we've just been talking you through. So this is just giving us a sort of broad idea of attendance for in-person arts activities and heritage over the last 12 months. So when we're sort of looking at these different groups, you've got those of families, students, retirees, and then also the overall. So overall, we have about, sort of 56% of the population surveyed were attending creative participatory activities and events, with about 84% attending any sort of arts or heritage in-person event. They're quite high. When we look at this compared to different groups, we see families and students, have a very high engagement level for arts events and heritage events in the last 12 months compared to those who are retired, where we see a drop in across the board, and actually the highest proportion of those who haven't attended any sort of arts activity and event in the last 12 months, which kind of gives you a sense of an idea of, who are attending what across the population. And so then we also see this sort of a greater gap between creative and participatory activities, and when we include heritage events for those who are retired, there's a much greater difference in that, suggesting that there's more interest in certain heritage events for those of who are already retired or of older populations. When we look at the rising cost of living as well as COVID-19 and how this is affecting attendance in these groups, we can see that actually COVID-19 overall is becoming much less of a concern for most of the population, still a very high proportion, 59% overall. We're actually, and then it's still slightly high for families and retired compared to students. But overall, it's more the rising cost of living that's putting off individuals attending cultural events. And this costs rising and people looking for more free or more affordable entertainment, which again is where we're going to sort of see these comparisons happening when we're looking at the data across Scotland in a sense of that we see those groups that are very much more secure when we're talking about the dormitory dependables, and those groups that sort of are potentially a little bit more security in aspects of living that are actually attending more. But this is sort of the great overall picture we're seeing across the UK, is that the cost of living is really the main concern for people attending events in comparison to COVID-19. When we take those groups again, so these three audience spectrum groups were sort of, as Ollie has explained, the sort of highest percentage of bookers for 22-23 in the Northeast and Highlands and Islands. And when we look at this, we actually see that for the rising cost of living is putting off dormitory dependables and home and heritage, those middle engaged groups, slightly more than commuter land culture buffs. Commuter land culture buffs, interestingly, there were ones that we actually saw a slight dip in, and we're actually seeing though, but less of the population, less of the of commuter land culture buffs. Only 46% are being put off attending events because of the cost of living, which is slightly less, suggesting that there's possibly other reasons for why we're seeing that dip. But still, overall, compared to the rest of the UK, there's a very high proportion of three groups who feel that the cost of living is sort of the largest aspect putting them off attending, which, yeah, again, seeing these comparisons between the Scottish or data we've already presented. And if we take this again and just go back and look at those groups where we're looking at families, students and retirees from the Cultural Participation Monitor, these are sort of the different statements we ask them when surveying about whether they're worried about the cost of living, whether they'll be looking for more free entertainment, or whether they'll be expecting to stay closer to home. And we're seeing a broad pattern for each of these things that's similar across all of them. So with regards to expecting to stay closer to home, this is a least of, these all represent those who strongly agree or agree with these statements, I should clarify. And we're seeing only sort of half of each group are, with a little bit less for retirees, expecting to stay closer to home for these events. So that's less of travel seems to be less of a concern than actually looking for more free entertainment and looking at whether they want to, whether they will be, whether they're going to be looking for free entertainment. Sorry, I've got this the wrong way around. Apologies, I think. Yes, I have. Sorry. So retirees are actually, less likely to strongly agree with these statements, which is actually quite interesting considering that their attendance is slightly less for these activities and events, whereas for families, it's a much, much greater concern for all of them, as well as for students. Again, showing the cost of living is really impacting all, but actually less so for retirees in comparison. With the overall stats, which actually, if we go back, is sort of mirroring what we're seeing here in relation to attendance. We're seeing less attendance for retirees, but interestingly, not as much, less numbers are actually agreeing with the cost of living impacting, which potentially suggesting for they're not, because they're not currently still working, this is going to be less impactful on whether they would be attending or not, and there's potentially other reasons for it. Sorry, I think I explained that the wrong way around. Right. So when we're looking then at attitudes regarding attending, just to sum that up more in general, if we're going back to those audience spectrum groups, is dormitory dependables are most likely to disagree really that COVID is effectively over. We see a lot of groups reducing in that they feel overall that COVID-19 is impacting, but dormitory dependables are most likely to, followed by metroculturals, kaleidoscope creativity and experience seekers, who are going to agree on slightly higher level. But overall, it's a very low number that are put off attending cultural events by COVID, and we're seeing that the cost of living is much more impactful. So where overall 59% are put off by the cost of living. Commuter line culture bus, 46% higher in relation to dormitory dependables and home and heritage, which were also 1% of. And we can also see that metroculturals similar level to commuter line culture bus, which are in the same engagement category at 46 and 49%. But overall, we're seeing a general trend in that matches what we're seeing in Scotland, in that the averages in terms of engagement is very similar, but also in relation to concern about the cost of living and COVID, potentially being a little bit more cautious. But we're on average seeing that similarity with the rest of the UK.
In relation to that, I think that's partly about the age profile of some places elsewhere. With the cost of living particularly affecting some of the younger groups and things as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that means it's back over to me, just to try and draw together a little bit about what this might imply, before hopefully getting your thoughts and contributions in terms of what you're seeing as well. So if we move on to the next slide, it's a complex picture. I've said it's a difficult picture partly in terms of the complexity of the data that I talked about at the outset, but also some quite stark differences between these sort of very, very urban, built up areas with very different populations relative to the overall the much wider rural areas, and of course the islands and so forth being very different as well. So Aberdeen is notably different, and probably needs to be treated separately. And Aberdeenshire, actually, we saw was quite distinctive in terms of that quite high concentration of more affluent groups of commuter line culture buffs, but also that kind of fringe of family groups sort of engaging in the city. But really flagging dormitory dependables has been this really key part of the story, both in terms of the population, in terms of engagement levels from that group, sort of the direction of travel in terms of that group. That's engaging more than they were as well. So if you like, they there's lots of them. They were important. They're going to get more important, and they're a quite interesting group in terms of some of their attitudes and the way they respond to things. So we saw there the bit that Ella was talking about, where they were most likely to disagree that COVID was over, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in itself is particularly putting them off. There's a greater tendency for them to say, well, yes, it's there, but you just sort of have to deal with it. You kind of just get on with life. So you get that sort of a bit of that tendency with them, but equally it needs, because of the type of taste they have, they tend to go for things which are relatively prominent, relatively reliable in terms of cultural product. So again, you could have need to factor that in, and if they are coming back, they're probably coming back to things not so much sort of the more experimental fringe stuff. And we are seeing a little bit of a rebalancing in terms of those core audiences, as was. So slightly lower proportions of commuter line culture buffs and heritage. Some greater prominence of the younger, more urban groups. Some of those, because obviously these figures are particularly looking across the last 12 months. So as the kind of cost of living is increasingly bitten, for some groups, particularly experience seekers, maybe are slightly being slowed down by that cost of living impact, and to a greater extent than some others. So metroculturals, where they're present, albeit in small numbers, may be less affected. So we might see a little bit of a shift back because of the cost of living until that hopefully eases. But we are seeing, I guess, this sort of slightly dynamic shift in the makeup of the audience, which is worth tracking and being responding to, and maybe not being surprised that people are responding to different things than we previously would have done, or different messages, because that could be about some of these different groups becoming more or less prominent. So if you just go back up. So yes, and we talked about that overall recovery picture in terms of, you know, fewer events, but nonetheless more sales overall, just about, but maybe less so recently rather than a few months back. So that's an overall summary of what we're seeing, both in terms of the population, in terms of audience attendance, in terms of that change in attendance, in terms of the wider context of sort of attitudes and things that might feed into that. But I'm really conscious that you are the experts in terms of this particular area, even though we're talking about this particular area as an event, and that the summary data we can give you will get us some distance, but not yet. It isn't everything by any means. So it'd be really great if you were happy to share some thoughts about what you're seeing with audiences, how you're seeing things change, and of course to ask us anything if you want to clarify any of this picture as well.